Springtime in Oklahoma brings the promise of rebirth. It's the most colorful season of the year. The brown and gray landscape of winter slowly responds to the longer and warmer days. Redbuds and dogwood are the early and sure signs that another winter has run its course. Suddenly, winter is gone, and green country visually matches its name. Spring is also the rainy season. Moisture that will be needed for the survival of man, animals, and plants during what is normally a long, hot, dry summer comes in the spring. But sometimes the spring weather turns harsher. The Oklahoma skies fill with clouds. The winds become stronger, and lightning strikes become more numerous. The thunder starts as a growling, rolling voice in the distance, only to become sharp and deafening. Within the beauty of spring lurks a monster, one of nature's powerful, destructive forces. Our technology has allowed us to make predictions or forecasts, but control of these events is still unattainable. Hurricanes, monsoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, droughts, and floods occur from time to time. And as Oklahomans know, our state is included in Tornado Alley. On January 31st, 1882, a post office was established with Jonathan T. Davis as the first postmaster. The post office was originally named Kauai, which is the Cherokee word for huckleberry. However, in 1887, the name was changed. Nathaniel Pryor had been a sergeant in the Lewis and Clark expedition and built a home 4 miles southeast of the town that was to be renamed Pryor Creek. The Katy Railroad was located in the territory and was built through Pryor Creek in 1871. A telegraph office was opened in 1889. As in many communities, the depot with its transportation and communication facilities became the focus of activities and additional growth. Pryor Creek was in many ways typical of the West. Pioneer families raised wheat, corn, and oats. Cattle ranches were numerous. Businessmen saw the possibilities of financial success. Tradition favors John Price as the first entrepreneur in Pryor Creek, opening a small store in 1882. As the local paper, the Clipper, indicated, the territory also had outlaws and ruffians who committed depredations of all kinds without fear of punishment. The census returns for 1900 indicate that the population of Pryor Creek was 495. By statehood in 1907, Pryor's population was 1,113. Pryor continued to grow, and by 1940, the population figure was 2,503. In 1940, the government selected a site just south of Pryor for the DuPont Company to operate a powder plant for the Defense Department. By 1942, the population of Pryor had increased to almost 8,000 people. The growth in population was mirrored in the growth of the business district in Pryor. The early beginnings of Pryor Creek at the turn of the century had seen a hotel, a livery station, a bank. Shops and businesses were lining up along what was to become downtown Pryor Creek. Even if it was only dirt, later Pryor Creek had bragging rights to one of the widest main streets in Oklahoma. The flagpole was the pride of the community. Many of the streets were not named, and most of the homes and businesses were not numbered. Directions to someone's home or business always started at the flagpole. By the 40s, Pryor Creek had become the business center of Mayes County. This small town, safe in the heartland of America, could not isolate itself from events taking place around the world. Its sons and daughters were going off to war. In support of our nation's war effort, DuPont had built a powder plant just south of the city. April 27th, 1942 was to witness the destruction of Main Street in Pryor Creek, Oklahoma. What had taken half a century to build was gone in less than 3 minutes. Unaware of what the day had in store for them, citizens of Pryor and the surrounding area had no doubt awakened to what they thought was going to be a typical day. Children went off to school. Many adults left for work downtown and at the powder plant south of town. Others had remained at home to work. But the day was going to be anything but typical.
The tornado hit Pryor at approximately 15 minutes till 5, April 27th, 1942. And I was a senior in high school, and I scheduled a last hour study hall so I could go to work a little earlier at Pryor 5 cent for $1 store. We'd received a shipment, and I was checking the invoice. And in the process of checking this invoice, the wind blew a board off of the back door where he'd had it boarded up where the glass had broken. And so I got a hammer and some nails and nailed it back. And I hadn't any more than turned around and walked off till the board hit me right in the seat of the britches flat. It just blew it flat. Well, I left the stockroom then, and about that time the lights went out, and Mr. Doherty said, let's put some batteries in some of these flashlights and hand it out to sales girls. So we were doing that, and then about that time this skylight in the back of the store blew in, the glass broke in, and that scared everyone up at the front, and everyone gathered more or less up to the northwest corner of the dime store. And Mr. Doherty and I were trying to lock the front doors. They were swinging doors, and we had one of them just about locked, but the other one just kept flipping and flapping, and that's the last thing that I recall. And I didn't hear a sound, and I know when that roof caved in that it made a tremendous noise, but I didn't hear anything. And we were just just outside the door when the bricks and everything was all settled down. That was the only spot that there weren't bricks. Bricks were in front of us, behind us, and everything.
Carl Curry was later to become mayor of Pryor, but in 1942, he was a young teenager working downtown after school. Ladima Purcell was working at the post office bookstore when the storm demolished that building. The clock at the front of the bookstore stopped at 4:45.
It completely demolished our building. It was a two-story building, and I was on the concrete floor under it all when they got through lifting the debris across and everything, you know. And I didn't, I'm sure I was knocked out, but I was in a position similar to that. And after a while, some man reached down and took hold of my hand. And when he did that, I squeezed his hand. And I'll never forget him saying, well, thank God she's still alive. And I was, but I wondered where I was. The powder plant men come in, and they just lifted one piece of debris and laid me on a board, a door. A door was loose there. And they just stretched me out on that door and carried me home.
Mrs. Purcell was later taken to a Tulsa hospital and remained there for almost a month. George Tilley was working at the First National Bank on the corner of highways 69 and 20.
Jay, you and I got within about, I'd say about 10 or 15 feet of the vault when it got just as dark as it would be if you're at the bottom of a cave and no lights. And then we went ahead and crawled the rest of the way in. We did get in the vault, and we started to close the vault door, and then somebody said, no, you better not do that, said something might fall in front of it. So we left the door open, and we could look towards the front of the bank, that part of the bank that was on Mill Street, and we could see corrugated metal just floating along like that, just like pieces of paper. Right in the middle of the intersection was a Pryor Lumber and Grain truck turned upside down. And as I say, we thought it was all over, and then it seemed like there was a backlash, so we went back in the vault. When we came out the next time, that truck was over against where the Griffin Grocery building was located. So somewhere or another, that backlash had picked that truck up and put it over in the northwest corner of the intersection. Walking home then, sometimes I'd walk on the sidewalk and sometimes I'd walk out in the street, but all along the street the car horns were honking. And I think what had happened was that brick and debris and things had landed on top of them and had shorted the horns out, I suppose, because they kept honking until the batteries finally ran down. That we originally thought those four corners was all it was hit. We didn't realize it was a tornado. We just thought it was a strong wind. But then when I got up pretty close to the Baptist church, well, about the only thing that was left there was the front door and the brick around the front door. And then in the back part of the Baptist church, the pulpit was still standing, and I understood that the Bible was open to the same page that Brother Spiller had preached from the night before. It hadn't done anything to the Bible, but it had torn the church up.
Lucille Stumpf was in an upstairs apartment over what is now Schaefer's office supply at 4:45 that day. She remembers.
All of a sudden, it seemed to get dark. And when it started getting dark, the window lights blew out. And then both of us jumped up and we ran to the hall. And when we got to the hall, we ran on into the apartment across the hall from us. The tornado hit the building. And when it did, the wall to the hallway went that way. And I glanced up and saw a crack that went to the alley. And when I did, Betty jumped out of the building. And before she sat down, the wind blew the divan, and she sat right on the divan. I could feel when they were trying to find us that there had to be a big nail in my back, and someone would step on that board, and I could feel it. The water would drip down occasionally on me, but I had no feeling whatsoever other than this nail that was in my back. And when they got us out, I went on to the Whitaker Hospital and went to the basement. And as they put me down, somebody yelled and said, "Don't put her there, that the ceiling's getting ready to fall in." And as they got me out, the ceiling did fall on the bed. And then from there, I went to the courthouse. And this is where my mother finally found me, was at the courthouse. The doctor had told Mother that there was no hopes for me to ever live. It came out in the paper that I did die in the storm, but Mother had an awfully hard time trying to convince people that no, she didn't. No, she didn't at all.
Howard Nelson was working just a half block north of Main Street when the tornado hit. After making sure that everyone was safe in his office, he headed off for Main Street and may have been one of the first ones on the scene.
When I got downtown, I thought when I saw the Main Street, I thought, well, at least be 500 people killed, because you just had to climb over everything. It was cars and trash and stuff just stacked up every place. And when I was going down the street, east end of Graham Avenues is the first place I saw what I thought was dead people. And at the east end of Graham Avenue, I counted 6 bodies, and one of these men that I had talked to in my office, I said that his wife had called me a year before. I saw him laying dead. We walked by run by the depot down there, and we noticed a young man clinging to a telephone pole. He just wrapped up around that, holding on to it. And the man with me said, "Should we put him on the shuttle train?" And I said, "No." I said, "I think he's dead. Look at his eyes." And he said, "No, I'm not dead. My eyes is full of mud." What had happened is Eyelashes blowed back under his eyeballs, and mud and stuff in his eyes made him look like he's dead.
Early highway patrol reports and newspaper headlines placed the death toll in the hundreds. Fortunately, these accounts proved much higher than the official death count of 52. 405 persons had been injured. It was clear that Pryor had suffered a catastrophe. An observer in an article in a Tulsa paper wrote, "Arriving in Pryor, I beheld the terrible wreckage of homes and business buildings of this once beautiful little city." Dr. Albert McCowan, who was the National Medical Director for the American Red Cross, flew into Pryor from Washington, D.C. He called what happened in Pryor a major disaster to those accustomed to dealing with nothing but major disasters. News of the Pryor disaster literally went around the world. The Stars and Stripes reported the event to servicemen. 3 news picture syndicates and a Chicago newspaper sent crews of photographers and technicians to handle pictures of the tornado. It was the first time that 4 portable picture transmitters had been in service in one city in the United States. At first, many of the survivors did not realize the extent of the damage. They had assumed that it was only their building or the location that they were in that had been affected. George Tilley left the bank in order to get home and see if his family was safe. He was dismayed at what he saw on Main Street. Ruth Hammer was working in the courthouse when the storm struck. Her mother had not been aware of what had actually happened downtown.
When I got to the house, my dad was sitting on the porch just out of breath, and I said, what's the matter? And he said, well, he said he was in the back. Of course, at that time it was May's Mercantile, and it's Sharps, you know, back there, and they had a store back of it, and somebody yelled a tornado, and so he went into the alley, and he ran all the way home. Now that was a good distance. And when he got there, Mother was sweeping water out of the house. It had come in around the windows and everything, and he said, she looked up and said, well, you darn fool. Didn't you know any better than to come home in the rain like this? And he told her, said, you just step out in the street and take a look down south. And when she did, she saw how he had come home.
After spending time trying to provide immediate help, Howard Nelson found his way north of town, hoping to find out if his wife and child were safe.
When I went out there, the people sitting on the porch or standing on the porches, they didn't know that the tornado had hit Pryor, and they wondered why I was kind of excited. And I told them, I said, Pryor blowed away. We need a lot of people. Come on, go with me back down on Main Street.
East of the city, the cemetery was unaffected, except for the top of the water tank, which had been twisted off by the freak wind. The small cemetery was soon to be expanded to include new graves for the victims of the tornado. Women, mothers, wives, and daughters. Men, husbands, fathers, and sons. The tornado was no respecter of gender or age. From her vantage point in the courthouse, Ruth Hammer and her fellow employees viewed this procession of the dead.
The town was just, well, terrible. And then, of course, for 3 days then, all the churches had been ruined where they could not be used. So for 3 days straight, they had funerals at the Masonic building, and we sat up on that, looked out the east windows. Every 30 minutes, a body was taken in, one was brought out, another one was taken in. They had those funerals, and I tell you, that was something else again.
The Reverend Ed Foreman of the Church of God officiated over the funeral for Daisy Abbott. Life is uncertain, life is brief. Even in the allotted 70 years and 10, man feels that it was only yesterday that he came upon this earth. But our stay upon this earth is only a sojourn, a stopover on our journey from one life to another. No one in his stopover here can make a greater contribution while here than to live a humble, faithful life with love for God. These people who have gone on to another life know that they contributed their best while here. Those of us who remain may rest in peace that we will join them in the next life, and that it is God's wish for us to get along now the best we can. Carl Curry wonders what the results might have been if the tornado had hit either earlier or later in the day.
I might say that if this had happened just a few minutes before or a few minutes after, there would have been a lot more people killed, either school children or the powder plant workers coming into town.
Max Adair, just getting off his shift at the powder plant, was leaving for Pryor as the storm hit.
When we started getting in the car that afternoon, Katie remarked, "You fellows can laugh at me if you want to, but we're going to have a tornado somewhere because it's just too hot and too sultry, and look how black it is in the west." And it become pitch dark, and a torrential rain, and sounded overhead just like a freight train was going over you.
A lady and child had been dropped off at the post office bookstore to be picked up in 10 or 15 minutes.
That lady and her child came in and sat down at our little table, ice cream table, and waiting for her husband to come in. And his brother was going out on the shift, and her husband was coming off, would pick her up and take her on to Salina where they lived. And they just were unfortunate enough to be there at the wrong time.
The movie house in Pryor was showing What's Cooking the afternoon of the tornado. When the storm began moving in, the lights went out, and everyone moved into the lobby of the theater. When the storm hit, the walls of the Safeway next door fell into the theater. If people had been watching the movie, they would have been killed. In one case, a family moved away from Pryor because of the tornado.
There was a man working out at the ordnance works that had a mobile home up 2 or 3 blocks north on Mill Street. It was Lee, or not Lee, but it was a Ball filling station, PL Ball filling station, that's what it was. And the storm didn't even hit that part of Pryor, but he was scared. There was so much damage that he decided he didn't want to live in Pryor anymore, so he moved to Pawhuska. And the very next Saturday night, the storm hit up there and he was killed.
As the Reverend Foreman had said, it was now time for Pryor to get along as best it could. Pryor was not left alone. The worst of times brings out the best in most of us. Help came from nearby communities, from other parts of Oklahoma, and from around the United States. David Sanderson, the assistant manager of the Midwestern branch of the Red Cross, came from St. Louis to direct relief activities. Dr. Albert McCowan, the national medical director of the Red Cross, arrived from Washington, D.C. to oversee medical services. More than 100 Red Cross nurses volunteered their services under the direction of Miss Rebecca Pond, nursing supervisor of the Red Cross Midwestern headquarters in St. Louis. Members of the Tulsa County Medical Society were attending a monthly dinner meeting the night of April 27th. When the call for doctors came from Pryor, the meeting was adjourned as Dr. Setwart, the Society's president, organized a 20-man squad which immediately flew to Pryor that night. Major Damon Nichols of the Salvation Army was in charge of the disaster work in Oklahoma. The dining room of Pryor's Community Center was used to serve sandwiches and hot coffee to more than 4,000 of the survivors and workers. "It's just our duty to help stricken humanity," Major Nichols said. Mrs. Zelma Ellis was the supervisor of the Works Project Administration school lunch program for Mays County. She helped feed hundreds of people all Monday night, all day Tuesday, and well into Tuesday night, when she finally had to be relieved by her daughter. Ron Stevens, the district administrator, recommended that Mrs. Ellis be given the Administrator's Award for her extraordinary service. The award had never been granted to a WPA school lunch worker before. As the immediate needs of Pryor were met, other forms of help continued. The CCC moved an entire camp from Shakota, Oklahoma, to Pryor to provide shelter. R.W. Stinson, state manager of the WPA, provided workers for the cleanup. The WPA had more than 2,000 workers in the Pryor area after the storm, averaging about 500 workers daily. Donations to help Pryor came from people who shared and understood the effects of a tornado. Schools and clubs from Bethany, where a tornado struck several years earlier, sent a check for $157.39. Friends of Snyder, Oklahoma, sent $77.80. Snyder had been the scene of one of the most devastating storms in the history of the nation, destroying the city and killing more than 100 people in 1905. The local Catholic Church was helped with its building plans.
When the churches in Pryor were damaged, that the story came out in the East that all the churches were destroyed except the Christian church. Well, a lot of the Catholics in the East took that to mean that the Catholic Church was destroyed. So Welch said that the members back in the East sent money to this area to rebuild the Catholic Church, and there was enough money sent in to build a Catholic Church.
Help came from so many individuals, groups, and agencies that it's impossible to mention them all. But even today, when the subject of the tornado comes up, the conversation turns to the work of DuPont, the powder plant south of town, and the Oklahoma ordnance workers who are remembered for the quantity and quality of their performance.
The men from the powder plant all began to come to town, and oh, I don't know what we would have done without them. They just really were wonderful. They worked night and day there for a while.
The thing I think that helped more than anything else, they were, all the people were down there building in the powder plant, area, and they just stopped everything and moved their machinery in and started cleaning up the town.
By nightfall, large generators and portable lights had been set up to aid in the search for victims and survivors. Trucks, cranes, tractors, and workers were provided to clean up the stricken city. Buildings and walls that were structurally unsafe were knocked down to avoid further injuries. Within minutes of the disaster, the call went out for all of the off-duty guards from the ordnance works to report to town in uniform. They helped police and the highway patrol establish order and direct the recovery. In 1942, Pryor citizens realized how important the DuPont company and its employees had been to the community. After the war, the powder plant was closed, and one of the first industrial parks in the state was created by the Oklahoma Ordnance Works Authority. The companies in this industrial development have continued to be vital to Pryor's growth. Employees participate and serve in many governmental and civic organizations. Just as in 1942, their skills, abilities, knowledge, and hard work are benefiting Pryor. Mayor Thomas Harrison told the citizens of Pryor that this tragedy killed everything but the spirit of the people. Physically, Pryor had been left in shambles. But in the midst of death, pain, and destruction, plans were being made to rebuild. The local newspaper reported, "People here had a resolute spirit. The dirge was replaced by the sound of hammer and saw. Grief was given way to regeneration. Pryor wanted to live." Mayor Harrison appointed a special emergency committee to develop plans for the rebuilding of the devastated business section of Pryor. Pictured here at their first meeting are Czar Langston, Orrin Stipes, Senator Sibley, A.C. Ed Burroughs of the National Red Cross, and Horace Andrews. These men, along with J.C. Wilkerson, president of the Chamber of Commerce and chairman of the City Council, were given the task of recreating Pryor. Mr. W.A. Graham might very well be the personification of the Pryor community. He was there at the start, building his first business in 1884. He had been an important community leader in the subsequent growth of Pryor. He owned and operated a general store that occupied a block on Main Street, the lumberyard, and the grain elevator. Mr. Graham started the First National Bank in Pryor, and at the time of the tornado, he was the oldest active bank president. His generosity to the community before the storm was only overshadowed by his own future giving and from his estate after his death in 1952. Ironically, on the afternoon of April 27, 1942, Mrs. W.A. Graham died after a long illness. 2 hours later, the town in which he had invested so much effort and determination was in ruin. However, even at 90 years of age, W.A. Graham was ready to help rebuild the town. Mr. Ken McDaniel, who serves as head of the Pryor-Mays County Emergency Service and is responsible for coordinating activities from the Communications Command Center, comments on how Pryor would react to such a disaster today.
In those days, they didn't have the techniques, the communication equipment, and the staff that are all trained by experts to respond to these different emergencies. We can utilize resources throughout the entire county, and we can expedite rescue work, and we do activate the Red Cross, Salvation Army, Department of Human Services, and those are the kind of things that in the past they did not have, and so what we anticipate on doing is to reduce the loss of life and respond quicker to the people.
Today, if someone looks closely at Pryor, he may still see the evidence of the 1942 tornado. A parking lot where a building used to be. A one-story or two-story building that formerly was 2 or 3 stories. Just as Mayor Harrison, the Emergency Committee, and the Chamber of Commerce had predicted, Pryor was rebuilt and has continued to grow for the next 5 decades.
I look at our town now, and I'm proud of Pryor. I've lived here all my life, and I'm proud of Pryor.
This program was funded in part by the Oklahoma Foundation for the Humanities.